Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Atheist Uprising. I am your host, Joshua Void, and today we're going to be delving into an atheist perspective of the soul. This is going to be a really interesting conversation because what we're going to do is at first we're going to make it into a two-part. So the first part is we're going to tackle how we perceive the soul. Me and my co-hosts are going to tackle how we perceive the soul. And then on the second part, we're going to see questions that theists ask atheists, and we're going to put those onto the screen so you, the viewers, can see, and we can also see, and we'll see how that is going to work. Okay, so this is, and we're going to try our best to answer those questions. So it's going to be a very interesting night tonight. Before we get started, I would love to welcome, I am really cool, Coolful 11. Welcome to the Atheist Enlightenment Uprising. Oops. And also Colder Pizza. Welcome to the Atheist Uprising. Nice to see you tonight. So, without any further ado, I would like to also thank our Patreon supporters. Thank you so much, Linear and TART, for helping us do what we love to do, which is produce content for you, the viewer. So thank you so much for helping us out in this endeavor. If you do want to support, the link is down below in the description. And again, thank you for coming and watching. Now, let's get started. I would like to welcome to the stage two of my co-hosts, Katy Sykes and Scott Williamson, here tonight. Welcome, and thank you for helping me delve into this conversation, an atheist perspective of the soul.
Absolutely, absolutely. Glad to be here.
Yeah, me too. Glad to be here. Before we start, though, I'd like to apologise to the viewers. I'm not on camera tonight. I had a bit of an allergic reaction on my face, so I look like a bit like a squashed tomato right now. So best not to be on camera, I think.
It's all
You'll just
good.
have to make do with my beautiful, beautiful voice.
It's all good. So before we get started, I just wanted to say to everybody, I hope you had a great Christmas, and I hope you had a great New Year's. How was your New Year's, Katy? And how was your New Year's, Scott Williamson?
Well,
Whoever wants to go first.
My New Year's filled with idiots, as much like the rest of my year. So.
Okay. Yes, I get that. And you as well?
My holidays were great. Got time off from work for Christmas and New Year's, and took some time off as well, and just had a really good time with family, friends, and hanging out. And yeah, it was awesome. It was really awesome. I couldn't have asked for a better time. So.
Oh, absolutely. And likewise with me too. I had an entire week after, like, in January where I was given that week off. So I am extremely ecstatic over that. And I just spend time with family, with my girlfriend and everything like that. So all is good on my part. So I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So without further ado, let's delve into the conversation. Katy, would you mind helping us delve into what do you think the soul is? What is the soul in your perspective as an atheist?
My perspective, well, there isn't one. There's no such thing as a soul. It's quite a simple answer, really. You know, I had this conversation with Eric Hernandez on one of my shows was last year or the year before, a couple of years ago. And, you know, he was proposing, obviously, the Christian idea of a soul and consciousness and all of that and everything, you know, as being separate from the body and everything. And I was arguing from the scientific point of view that it's all just part of the brain. It's just a concept which the brain has put forward, which is the consciousness, as a way of explaining actions that we take. And within neuroscience, obviously the new research and everything has found that actions take place before the consciousness is even aware that the actions have taken place. Nanoseconds we're talking about, but it just shows that, in my mind, it just shows that there's no such thing as the soul. There's nothing separate to the brain. The brain is just part of the body, and it just reacts to stimuli very much like a machine does.
Okay. I would have a tendency to agree. And Scott Williamson, what do you think the soul is? And do you think that we have one?
Have a soul. That really just depends on definitions and all that. But if I was going to go along with the traditional view, like the Catholic view or the Islamic view of the soul, no, I don't believe any of that. There's no reason to. Not that I'm opposed to it. It'd be, well, maybe I'd be opposed to it. I have no idea. The idea of a consciousness disembodied, floating around in space forever, that may be hellish. You never know. I mean, people kind of assume that it's a wonderful, blissful state to be in because you're living forever, right? But I don't know if I'd want to actually have that. It depends. I don't know, unless there's some mechanism to make it blissful and forever. I don't know how that works. It seems like pleasure, pain, all of that stuff is the result of nerve endings, physical nerve endings connected to a brain that processes information so that you feel some sort of way about things. And if it's disembodied, how can it feel anything? And then
That's a very good point.
and then there's people that actually do not feel anything in life. They can actually turn their certain parts of their spinal cord, they can turn it off. People won't feel pain or anything, and those people are going crazy because they get no stimulus, they get no stimuli. And I'm afraid if I was a disembodied consciousness, where's my stimulus going to come from, if this is true? So I don't know how to feel about that. I just have no information to go on. Now, as far as we can even talk about the Bible view of the soul versus the Christian view of the soul,
Right.
which are two different things.
Mhm.
So again, it just depends on our definitions, what we mean by them. But as far as I'm concerned, I have no real reason to believe in them because I've never experienced having one, I don't think.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'm just agnostic about those sort of things,
Understandable. And likewise for me too. When I was thinking about this show, in a sense, and before coming on, and even before that for the entire week, I was thinking about what is, in essence, a soul supposed to be. Because since it's supposed to be something that is disembodied, to me, it sounds like they're looking for something to call consciousness, or this underlying state of consciousness, which a lot of individuals would like to say mental things or non-physical things, which I don't agree with at all. But still, that's what some people like to state. And to me, I feel that the soul in and of itself, because sometimes when people say the soul of something, they mean it more in like an artistic or more of like a poetic thing, and not necessarily something that is real and tangible in a sense. Certain poets love to utilize, and if they're talking about whatever the situation may be, if a man is speaking of a woman in poetry or vice versa, they would like to say, and this person also had a beautiful soul, meaning like a nice personality, a beautiful characteristics in a sense, and traits. So when we really look at that, it seems that the soul in and of itself is kind of embodied in multiple different contexts without necessarily being derived in a more religious sense. So I think just like how you stated, Scott, it's more based on the context of what somebody is talking about when they are stating something is of soul, in a sense.
Yeah, I like that point that you've made there as well. I mean, like, if we're just talking about the conceptual idea of a soul as far as the personality of a person, then I have no problem with that. You know, obviously people have personalities, and if we want to, you know, section off a certain part of that personality and call it a soul, then fine. It's a concept, and we can all get behind that. It's just the religious side of it when you're saying it's something that's disembodied, that's just floating around in the ether somewhere. Then, well, where's your evidence?
Right.
What proof do you have of that? You know, so that's when I start to go, well, that's just the realms of idiocy right now, trying to convince me of something like that.
Yeah, and you know, who's to say what the soul is? It just depends on the context and where you're adopting the idea from. Like there's the Hebrew idea of the soul, like the ancient Hebrew idea. Then there's the ancient Greek idea of a soul. Then there's like the Far Eastern traditions that of anatta, which anatta is the Buddhist teaching that there is no such thing as self or the soul, that it's a human construct, that it's just a story we build up. But
well, the Native American, you know, spirit animals and stuff.
Well, in Buddhist tradition, like maybe in Hindu tradition, there may be a different view on that. I'm not sure, but I know in Buddhist tradition, there's this term called anatta, and it means no self, and it's connected to another Buddhist teaching, which is the principle of unattachment. So their whole idea is, if you want to live a peaceful life, don't get attached to things lasting forever. You know, like understand that you're just like everything else in the world. You're here for a moment, and then you're gone. You know, things change constantly. The only constant in reality is change. And so they say, don't get too attached to loved ones, to material things, even to yourself, because even yourself is just a construct that's going to go away one day. And there's all kinds of thought experiments within the tradition to kind of point that out. Kind of sort of similar to the ship of Theseus analogy, which is more of a Greek analogy of the same thing regarding self. But in the ancient Hebrew, nephesh was the word for soul, and all it means is derived from the word breath. So you read in Genesis, like God breathed into man the breath of life, and he became a living soul or a living being. And even animals too, he breathed into the animals the breath of life, and they became living souls. All the fish in the seas were living souls. And so souls simply means, in the Jewish way of thinking, it just means you're a being. You know, you're a human being or an animal. Yeah, right? Just an awareness. You know, you're alive. Yeah. It's life force. You know, you're living. And once you die, you're conscious of nothing at all. God takes the breath away from you, and that means that once you die, you don't exist. And so the Hebrews used to speak of the forefathers being asleep. You know, they'd call the dead sleeping. So they kind of equated it to sleeping, like Lazarus, for example, was asleep in the tomb before Jesus resurrected him. So that's kind of a very Jewish idea. But then, of course, as you read through the New Testament, you get this Greek influence, like especially in the book of John, where, you know, you have this idea of an immortal soul that everyone has, you know, that goes to heaven, you know. So it just depends on what people are talking about.
Josh, could you just highlight Calder Pizza's comment, please?
Absolutely. I was actually going to do that right now. Let me just see. Right here. Here you go.
Yeah. Thank you for putting that in there, Calder Pizza. And both me and Scott, we're XJWs as well ourselves.
Mhm.
So we can definitely understand your searching for atheist topics and trying to get a more decent perspective and stuff. But I like the comment here that you've put in about how Jehovah's Witnesses view a soul, about there being no separation from the body. I'm sure Scott has a little bit more to say on that specifically.
Yeah, it's forget which book it was. I think it was Ecclesiastes that the dead are conscious of nothing at all. That when they die, they're asleep, and even Jesus spoke of the dead as asleep, being asleep in death. And so there was no Jewish notion of some immortal soul that would live on after you were the soul. The body, the mind, everything was just the soul. And that's what they meant. And it was the Greeks who came along, the Platonic soul, that sort of teaching evolved. And in the early church incorporated that, especially because they were proselytizing to Greek audiences that could better understand the teachings if you would just incorporate some of these concepts that they were familiar with, and it seems like there's some sort of evidence that that was what helped evolve the New Testament over time, was the early church's political move to incorporate Greek ideas. That's why we have Greek holidays involved in Christianity. It goes on and on. But yeah, the soul was just one of those concepts, I suppose.
Yeah. And I always found when I was the Jehovah's Witness, I always found that the soul was what sort of a concept that God was sort of using to sort of instill fear into you. So it was like sort of this soul is part of you now, but it's also your eternal life after Armageddon, and I can just take that away from you if you don't do what it is that I tell you to do, if you don't follow my commandments. So it was sort of a thing, a thing that was used by Jehovah's Witnesses, specifically the governing body, to gain control over people within the congregation.
Yes, like that memory, I will remember you on the last day. And so your soul will not be destroyed. God will remember you. And so in that way, you're sort of alive, at least in the mind of Jehovah. And yeah. And which when you look at, I see another comment regarding the 144,000 that actually do go to heaven, which is kind of maybe a little bit weird. Like, if there is no immortal soul, then how does he resurrect his followers to live in heaven? Isn't he using some inanimate part of them? But from what I understand in the Bible, or at least in the Jehovah Witness theology, I guess they are sort of recreated. God recreates a spirit body for you, and then that body goes to heaven. But yeah, that's the way I kind of understood it.
Yeah, Calder Pizzas just put a message, comment in there about how there's a separation within Jehovah's Witnesses between the soul and the spirit, and obviously they have the scriptural context for that. I'm not quite sure on the scriptures anymore, but yeah, I do remember that myself as well.
Right. And for me, because I'm not part of the Jehovah's Witness, or have been part of the Jehovah's Witness, so I'm not particularly sure their point of view based on the soul in general. And I know that they're more of a what is it called? Destructionist, I believe is called, or where like the soul is destroyed, if anything.
Annihilationist. Yeah.
Annihilationist. Thank you.
Annihilationist.
Yeah, annihilationists and stuff like that. But besides that, I'm not particularly sure on their point of view of the soul. But another thing that I was kind of thinking about too was the thing that Wes put up beforehand, which is also based on Socrates and Plato's dualistic nature of the soul is eternal unchanging, unlike the body that is finite and does change. Fedor says more about it, but I tend to think it's nonsense, bullshit. But I think where Plato was kind of going, because Plato's theories, or not theories, but I guess you could say hypotheses, more or less, is built around, or philosophies are built around the idea of the form, in a sense. So there would need to be a form of something else that is quote unquote perfect or whatever, because at this very moment we are the imperfect bodies of what is within that realm of forms, which is the perfect essence of us. And henceforth, that dualistic perspective that appears from the Socratic and Platonic view of dualism, in a sense, is also taking into account the realm of forms. But I think the problem is that when we truly delve into that, because I do think the realm of forms is an extent of a soul, in a sense, that you're the imperfect entity of that soul perfection, which is out there. We can't achieve that until we die and return back into the realm of forms. However, I find that problematic because, in a sense, it kind of builds up the Christian viewpoint of like the material world is more or less a challenge or some sort of test, and that the body in and of itself is a disgusting type of entity, but the soul is the thing which is perfect, in a sense. But I think that it's the opposite way around. I think that the reality is that the body, not the body is perfect. Obviously, the body has certain issues to it, but it's because it has issues and flaws that it shows the beauty of the body in and of itself, in a sense. It's because of these aspects of being flawed that we can see the beauty in things. In my opinion.
Right. No, that's a really good point, actually. You know, something similar to that. I was talking to Greg Rogers the other night.
Yeah, I saw that
on my
show.
channel. Oh, you did see it? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Yeah, and we kind of did a internal critique, just granting, yeah, there's souls, there's spirits, there's God, all of these, your God, especially, and we can grant all these things, or at least grant like the supernatural. And so we talked about like I think he was alluding to Pascal's wager when I was saying, but what is a good reason, even if all of this may be true or not, what is the reason that you would have to believe in such things if you're admitting you don't have evidence for it, if you're admitting that this stuff is based on faith, then what is the reason why I should have faith in these things too? And his answer was Pascal's wager. And so just play it safe. And I'm like thinking to myself, and so I came up with this, and it's really strange because you hear a lot of these stories from a lot, suspiciously, a lot of people that go through these near-death experiences, and they come back and they always come back with the same story. One of the same things that they'll tell you is that this life here is not a courtroom, but this life is a school. And that's what they always come back and say. And so I was turning the Pascal wager on its head to say, well, what if being an atheist was the way to pass the school and go to heaven, while all you other guys, theists and people who are gullible, didn't pass the test because you gave in to things without sufficient evidence, and God makes you come back and go back to school over and over and over until you pass the test, when the only people who pass the test are the agnostics and atheists. Have you ever thought about that? Maybe you're playing the Pascal wager wrong. And he was like, that's a good, never thought about that. I was like, in fact, a lot of people that experience these NDEs say that when they do talk to the spirit or the God or whatever they're going to call him, he always tells them, religion is separation. all of this stuff is separation, and you were so vigilant for your separation, so you failed. You got to go back. You know, the ones who are really passing and don't have to go back are the ones who pass the test and don't believe in any of that stuff, because I have nothing to do with none of that. So, not saying that that's true or anything like that, but just doing an internal critique. Yeah, it's just a thought experiment to turn that on its head. You know.
Yeah, I've always used that. I used to use that on my old show, if you remember, Scott. I'd use that similar sort of argument. I use the argument about intelligence. And if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, it would mean that he would also be all-intelligent. And one thing that he would value more than anything else would be intelligence. And if he hasn't told us anything about him, given us any evidence to prove that he's there, then the intelligent thing would be not to believe in him at all. So maybe that's what he would, if he did exist, maybe that's what he would be looking for. So when it comes to that judgment day that a lot of Christians talk about, you'd get there, all Christians would be thrown into hell, and all the atheists would live forever in heaven. You know, not that any of us would want to be in heaven, but
right.
Sorry,
Especially
God, I'll give that a pass.
Yeah, especially after meeting a few of the people that are supposed to be going to heaven. I think I'll pass.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I'll get off the bus. Like, you just you guys go on without me, kind of thing.
I'll go to hell where there's so much drug use and prostitution and all the fun.
It'd be nice to gloat in front of all the Christians that are just about to go to hell, though, wouldn't it? Before
yeah,
told you.
Told you.
Absolutely, and I think that's something, because you're right, that did kind of flip Pascal's wager on its head, because it's still granting that there exists a being, but that being in and of itself is trying to test its own creation, in a sense, in order for them to grasp at things that they can kind of fix their own, you know, rather than constantly relying on it. And it's kind of like a parent, for instance, when you have a child, for a certain extent, yes, a child is relying on that parent, but after a while, it's kind of like, okay, you got to go and do your own thing at some point, you know? And that's the whole entire thing, I think, that is, how could I say it? That is beautiful about not having a soul, in a sense, in my opinion, is that you get to command your own ship towards a certain extent, right? Like, you're no longer feeling that you're being dictated, because I do think that if we really look at the non-poetic existence of a soul, because I do think that soul in general is accommodated or has transformed over the years, or over the millennia, for instance, in order to bring forth other poetic connotations of the soul, like the one that we were discussing beforehand. However, I think all origins to what soul meant was this eternity thing, this thing that can last for eternity. And for me, I think that even though the poetic version of soul is something that I can, how could I say, that I can understand, I think that sometimes we need to utilize a better word, in a sense, in order to distance ourselves from what the original connotation of what that used to be, you know? Because I think that a lot of people, and let alone even theists, when they hear people, even atheists, talk about like the soul of something or whatever, they automatically jump to the conclusion, look, see, now you believe in souls. And we kind of run into this conundrum of trying to explain what we're trying to say. But if we utilize a different word, then there is no more confusion, and everybody knows where or what we're talking about and where we're coming from. And I think that's the best way in order to tackle this idea of soul, because even though, just like how I was talking about beforehand with the context and the connotations of what soul has meant poetry, or when it comes to talking about how a person's inner characteristics are, for instance. I do agree with Katy 100% that it's not even that there's no evidence. Even philosophically, there are problems that come from that. And with these problems, they're not coherent with the understanding of what a soul is. And I think that is something that needs to be tackled more in order to really show individuals why there's not really that said connection, at least philosophically, because we all come to our knowledge through logic and everything like that. Even through our philosophical discussions, we're utilizing the logic of our own brain in order to tackle the problems which are out there. And I think with soul talk, we need to use the same thing too. And we can't say that something is mysterious to us when the more we look at the road and the more criterion we check off against that prospect, the more the unlikelihood is that that actually exists within the world itself.
I think the problem is that we all exist inside our own heads. And so I think logically, right in the beginning, the soul probably came about because of this sense of self that we have. And because we exist within ourselves, sometimes it feels like logically, if you don't have all of the scientific evidence and everything that we have today, it sort of feels like we are separate to ourselves, that there is this part of us which is different to the body, works differently to the body, that sort of exists outside of the body. Like, for instance, when we sleep, we dream, we go to these different places and things. It sort of feels like we're not, it's not attached to us in some way. So I think logically, without all the other evidence in the beginning, logically it was very logical and very reasonable to say, well, yes, there is this part of us that exists separate to ourselves. But I think we've outgrown that now. I think that we need to start moving away from that prehistoric way of thinking, and using that prehistoric logic, and start moving towards what's actually reasonable with the evidence that we have today.
Yeah, and a lot of people make arguments from ignorance, and then they have these taxicab fallacies where they use logic to get to the soul. They'll use some sort of logical framework to get to God and the soul. But then when they face with tough questions, they'll jump out of the taxicab and say, well, God's ways are higher than man's ways. We'll never understand. And then they'll jump right back in the taxicab to keep on arguing logically for different things. And so they're not very consistent. And then they'll argue from ignorance to say, well, because we don't understand consciousness, then that means that the soul exists, or this particular understanding of the soul exists. And that's just not very rational, I don't think. I mean,
Gaps argument.
Yeah, because, it's a gap argument. Like, I totally understand on materialism, consciousness creates what they call a hard problem, because it can't really reconcile itself with material. On the other hand, if you go into supernaturalism or something like that, now you've got a hard problem of matter. So if you're like an idealist, or you want to say that consciousness, that the material world derives from consciousness, well, then now you have to explain, how does that work? How do you get the material world from consciousness? It's all just it's a big problem either way. I tend to look at it like not necessarily dualism, but I look at it like reality is two faces of the same coin. Like, we've got the material side, like our brain and body, and then we've got this experiential, conceptual side, which is not physical by its nature, but subjective. Can't be studied. You can't get behind consciousness to study it. We're kind of all doing science within consciousness itself, So you've got that aspect. But then we have this agreed upon category called the concrete. So we can measure this stuff scientifically and objectively. Like, we can all agree that the rock is here and it looks like this and it feels like that and it weighs this much and it does this. That's a whole different category than a subjective category, a conceptual category, which is like imagination, which is like, thoughts and things you can't measure necessarily. They're subjective by nature. And so I just tend to boil it down to, this is just the reality we live in. I mean, there's no scientific way to predict when a piece of matter will become conscious without doing a lot of hand waving. That's true. So I think the most reasonable thing, an honest thing to say is, I don't know, but I tend to lean towards that it's just two sides of the same coin. And, it comes along with a specific matter, like a brain and body, human brain, animal brain, human brain. And there is certain examples of, say, brainless, matter that acts intelligently, that works like, above the DNA. I was watching some sort of video about that, but they're still embodied. It's still a cell. It's still some sort of body thing. We don't have any example of a disembodied soul or mind. There's just no example of that.
Right.
I think you also stumbled on a good on something good earlier. A point that you made earlier, Scott, about stimuli. As regards to a soul, we can actually measure what different stimuli can, at how they there's in neuroscience, they can run certain stimuli through the brain to create different thoughts, to create different reactions and things like that within the consciousness, and they can completely change somebody's consciousness simply by running stimuli through it. Now, imagine this soul is disembodied. How is it going to, without that stimuli, which we can actually demonstrate the stimuli can change what's happening there, what stimuli is it going to have? And I think that's an absolutely fantastic point you brought up earlier. It couldn't possibly exist outside of the brain because it would have no stimuli there to actually to interact with.
Exactly. It's I try to listen to everyone's arguments on the other side and try to have some sort of answer for those things. One argument against that would be maybe that the brain is sort of like a radio transceiver, so that this weird consciousness thing or soul thing gets into your radio receiver, your brain, inhabits it, and then it's sort of limited to the functionality of that modem, if you will, modulator, because it's modulating. It's limited. It's a piece of machinery, so it's going to feel pain. It's going to feel impulses from genes, from nerve endings, from all of these things. So it's sort of like a receiver. It's like a tool that the soul uses to have an experience. But the soul itself is something totally different. It's just what they would call a raw experience, like a raw experience. Like you could imagine,
so it's just a radio wave.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you could imagine taking a brain out of the body, out of the head, putting it in a jar where it's isolated from all your nerve endings and everything like that. And what would that brain experience?
Nothing. Dead.
Nothing. I would say nothing. But these guys would say, oh, it's just pure awareness. It's just some sort of.
The problem with that, though, is like a radio wave, like anything that isn't like, that's similar to like a radio wave, like what they're explaining there. If it doesn't have a receiver to pick up that wave, it's just a wave. It's meaningless. It doesn't. It's nothing.
Right.
It's just. It's just a wave function.
It would be unconscious.
Around in the, there would be nothing there. So it takes something to interpret it for it to actually become a message or whatever it is, or a sound or whatever.
Absolutely. Like you need the senses. And I think a lot of people want to try to separate the brain from the senses and say, well, the brain can still have experiences or still experience things or is able to imagine things outside of the realm of the body. But the whole entire thing, even based on memories and everything like that, and the way that we experience is through our senses. And it's actually based on the memories through which our senses pick up that actually create the person who we are today, in a sense. And I had this conversation prior to coming onto the show with my girlfriend, and she was absolutely correct, in my opinion, at least, with that question. She asked me, "What do you think makes people, and not makes people, but makes the person what they are today?" And she asked, do you think that it's memories that make us who we are?
That's a fantastic point.
Right. And I love it. And to me, I stated yes, but at the same time, I stated, I think too is based on how we interact in the present as well, which also creates who we are today as well. Because through the stimulus that is coming at us at this very moment, we do make decisions. And through those decisions, you are now engaging in building your personality around those said decisions that you are making.
And not just the present as well, but also the anticipation of the future and the future things that you'll do.
Exactly. And all things seem
which all comes from memory.
Exactly.
And when you're thinking about like the talk, the Christians obviously have a go at us all the time for making the argument that, you know, the mind is just and the consciousness, for instance, is just neurons firing in the brain. But that's what memory is. Memory is connections between the neurons. It's patterns within the neurons that make us remember things. So if you separated it from the neurons, it wouldn't have no memory, so it wouldn't have no sense of self.
Exactly.
It wouldn't have no experience to draw upon. Yeah.
And it would be
a fantastic point.
Yeah, yes, and that correlation is definitely tight, you know, between the mind and the body. The correlation is obviously there, because without the body and the mind, or the brain, you wouldn't have a mind. You wouldn't think, at least, because, you know, you change the brain, you know, I cut my finger off, it's going to change the quality of my conscious experience. And that's kind of undeniable. And so that now they will say, like, technically we have no theory of why something like an experience should occur. Like all of this, like David Chalmers would say, like all of this could go on in the dark. We could be like computers and just, you know, operate without some sort of experience to go along with it, possibly. Like call it a philosophical zombie, I guess is what it is. And so what they'll say is, well, because we have this really weird thing, consciousness, that has to be correlated with the function of the neurons, the brain, and this and that, and this and that. There's no theory to explain it for all this time. Therefore, the soul, therefore God, and all the rest of it. And so it's just an appeal to ignorance. You know, it's like an argument from ignorance at that point.
Absolutely. And I think too, because just like how Linear stated also, is that, yeah, I also think it's about your brain structure and development. And I think that is also a very good point, because it's very true is that if your brain is structured in a particular way, then there seems to be I don't want to say a dictated path, because that's kind of, but there's kind of like a path that you go down in a sense. And Linear, let me know if I'm actually understanding your point correctly, but are you trying to say that if a person's brain, in a sense, is a particular way, does that mean, like, let's just say if somebody is a psychopath, for instance, would you say that I don't want to say the road, but their behavior would be as such? Or are you stating something completely different? And please let me know inside the comments if that is the case or not. Because to me, that's what I would be thinking. I would be thinking that if somebody's brain is wired in a particular way that makes them more or less like a psychopath or a sociopath, for instance, then we kind of the road, whatever, I'll just use road. The road which is before you is kind of already set in a sense. That doesn't mean that you're going to kill anybody, but your empathy is not going to be there for the majority, or not even the majority, for all people that you encounter or whatever.
I sort of agree.
Pardon?
I'd sort of agree, because in psychology, that's what sort of therapy is there for. So therapy is designed to give you extra experience, to give you extra information, to be able to change the direction that your neural pathways are wired, sort of to rewire it in a new way, sort of thing. So I would sort of agree, and maybe not to the full extent of what you were
like,
saying.
a really weird thing about consciousness is this neuroplasticity. Like if you take the philosophy of emergence, like metaphysical emergence, what do they call it? Ephemeralism or something. I can't even think of the name of it. Epiphenomenalism. So what that would say is that on a materialism, consciousness emerges from the brain, not the other way around. In other words, consciousness is the end result of a process. It's not going to have any causal powers on its own. Impossible, because the brain the consciousness has emerged from the brain. But the weird thing about that is actually our thoughts and our training and our learning can create neural pathways and physically affect our brain. And so it kind of works two different ways. So there's some sort of energy about your consciousness that can have like this retrocausality effect, or backwards causality, which is really cool. And it's just really interesting. These things don't, to me, indicate a soul or anything like that, but someone like Eric Hernandez or someone may actually use those sort of arguments to kind of bolster that position. They may say like, yeah, it's kind of like your brain is kind of like the CD, like
he has the guitar analogy, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I
like
remember the brain
is just
just the strings, whereas the consciousness or the soul is the composer, is the person who's playing the strings, playing the melody.
Right. That's the analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, because, if both of you want or whatever, would you want to make this show a little longer?
Sure. I'm good for that.
Because we still have the questions I do want to bring up.
Yeah, let's go into those. Yeah.
But beforehand,
we have a lively chat tonight, so we could even. If you, I was asking you in private chat there, Josh, about an after party. I know we're not doing one tonight, but if we were having a bit of a longer show, we could even ask if anyone in the chat wanted to join in for 15 minutes.
I'm down. I'm definitely down if somebody wants to join in after like the hour mark and somebody really wants to jump in or whatever. I can definitely link the Patreon, what the hell, the StreamYard, and you guys can come in and have a conversation with us as well and delve into the conversation of the soul also. If you
at the hour mark, though, I might have to pop off and just 5 minutes, just make myself a cup of tea because I'm parched. But
no, it's perfectly fine. So if anybody does want to come on or whatever, that's perfectly fine. And you don't need to come on to show your face either. If you want to come on but just be voice, that's also good too. Just let me know on the in the comment section down below if you want to come in, and then after I'll definitely just like link you the
voice
stream.
In the ether.
Voice.
I am the soul.
Yeah, the soul is totally.
Souls do exist. No, but all in all, the question about the soul is something that's really interesting to me and has been interesting to me for quite some time, and definitely after coming from an Islamic background and stuff like that, and coming out of that really does shine a light in a sense about what do we perceive as a soul, for instance, and can there be an actual thing that is called this, or just like how Katy and how Scott Williamson put it extremely well, that we just don't know, or there's just no evidence of that. And more likely, if we look at it through through a philosophical lens, we'll see that there's a lot of problems with the soul in and of itself being something that is existent within the world. But now, before we go on, I do want to put up some questions. And Katy, if you do need to take that break in order to get yourself something to drink, please go ahead. Me and Scott will continue a conversation. And once you come back, I'll put up the questions.
I'll just pop off and go make a cup of tea now, and then I'll be
Sounds
back.
like a plan. So, and by the way, if anybody who's in the comment section right now wants to ask any questions, please do. If you're looking and you're kind of like on the fence about a soul and you want to just ask an atheist what we perceive or whatever the situation may be, please throw in the question, and we'll definitely try to answer it to the best of our capabilities. But at the same time, I don't want to force anybody to do that either. So It's up to you. But all in all, I think what the soul was supposed to be, and I think Scott and Katy were right about that. The soul in and of itself was supposed to be, that's actually a very good question, inquires abound. Okay, what is the alternative of a soul, and why do you believe in that idea? And that actually coincides with a question that has been asked to tons of atheists just online, which is, do you believe in a soul, or do you believe in consciousness? And I think that the two are kind of enmeshed together into one. In a sense, the soul and the consciousness kind of unites into one essence or one entity. And for me, what I would say is that I think the alternative to the soul is consciousness, the thing that gives us awareness of our environment, which is around us, and including within us as well. And I think that in and of itself is what people have constantly been asking when they ask about the soul, is what is the characteristics within you, and how do you engage with the world around you, in a sense.
Yeah, the problem that I've always had with things like an immortal soul is the way that I've understood it is this immortal soul is immortal, it's perfect, it's like this higher being, right? And then you're kind of stuck in this fleshly body with all its limitations. And so you may be a bad person in the world, but then where is the foundation of judgment? Like, if your soul is different from your body, then why are people's souls being judged for what happens to, like, how they behave? Like, if you're Hitler, but the higher Hitler is this soul that's perfect and loving, and it just happens to inhabit the body of Hitler, is that a bad soul, or is it just a bad body and bad brain? Right? Because that's the part that I'm not understanding. Like, they say that, the brain is like a radio receiver, that it's got, it's like if you've got a broken radio and you're trying to play some FM radio station and it's only coming out one speaker, you don't blame the radio station, you blame your radio for having a broken speaker, right? and you try to get it fixed and make the sound better so it expresses the music that's coming out of the radio station better. But you would never punish the radio station because your radio's not playing music properly because it's broken. So it seems to be like the same problem with judgment day. Your soul's going to burn forever in hell. Why? It didn't have anything to do with the body that it inhabited, did it? Because by definition, they're supposed to be different, right? I don't know.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. And
Click wrong button.
No, sorry about that. Go ahead, Katie. What's up?
No, I was saying I'm back. I'm sorry about dropping out there. I clicked the wrong button when I came back.
Oh.
No worries. So, Katie, what is the alternative to the soul, and why do you believe in that idea? This is a question that Fires Abound has asked.
Okay. Oh, you're throwing the big ones at me. Just sat down. Give me a chance. Right. What is the alternative to the soul? Well, I think within science, it's the consciousness, isn't it? Two parts of the consciousness, subconscious and the consciousness that we all perceive. Why do I believe in that idea? Well, because there's evidence for it. Unlike the soul, which has been bandied around by different religions for thousands of years, no evidence has ever been produced that it actually exists. There's no quantitative data that we can look at to say, well, that's what it is. That's what it looks like. Whereas science has given a lot of evidence for the consciousness. We know what the consciousness is. We know where it comes from. We know how it works within the brain, which parts of the brain control different parts of the consciousness. We can show through neuroscience, we can show how different stimuli can affect different parts of the consciousness, turn certain aspects of the consciousness on and off, or change certain ideas that we have. So there's a lot of evidence to support that the consciousness is there, but there's no evidence to support that the soul's actually there.
Yeah, I would say that the soul, the idea of a soul is a concept, so it's an inference, whereas consciousness is primary. So the first thing we know consciousness exists because here I am talking and we're all agreeing to talk to each other. We're all assuming we're all conscious. So we kind of like, that's the real thing, probably the only thing I really know is that I'm conscious and that I exist. And the rest of it is an inference. So these concepts like soul, hell, heaven, God, these things come after, and out of being a conscious person,
Right.
I'd like to respond to this one because I actually have responded to Eric Hernandez on this on this point on a show that I did a while back. And it all depends as to what you're talking about, what the theist is talking about when they're identifying the consciousness as a soul.
Right.
Are they simply just renaming the consciousness as a soul and it's still got all the same properties as a consciousness within the scientific model that we have right now? Or are they trying to say that the consciousness is the soul and it exists outside of the body? Because they're two very different concepts. One which I would say, well, if you're just going to name it the soul and it's still the consciousness, fine, I'll go along with that. It's just a concept. So that's fine. The other, I'm saying, the same point as before. Where's your evidence? There's no evidence that it exists outside of the body. So why should I start believing that? Bring me some evidence and I'll consider it and I'll weigh up the evidence that we have now and the evidence that you bring along, and I'll weigh up which is the best to actually start following. But so that would be my answer to that.
And how about you, Scott? What do you think about this particular question?
Yeah, it's kind of semantics at that point. It's kind of like saying God is the universe. It's just a semantic play of words. It could have some utility for you, I guess, if you're going to talk about a particular topic in order to kind of frame your ideas, maybe, depending on who you're speaking to. But it's still a semantic game. it's kind of like, well, consciousness exists, therefore the soul exists. Yay, I win. You know, okay, great. But you've kind of created a straw man because no one's really disagreeing that consciousness doesn't exist. You know, if you need to understand what people are talking about, you know, like Katy, she said, depends on what you mean. You know, if you're just going to use soul as another word for consciousness, like a synonym, you're not really saying anything, I don't think, meaningful.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with that as well, and I think and kind of I'll answer the two, and after I'll jump into the follow up question. But I think that at first, when you respond to the theist who equates the soul with consciousness, I think that there's two differences between the two. The first difference is that the soul is supposed to be something that's eternal and goes beyond the body itself, whereas consciousness, even though that a lot of people try to equate that, and I think the reason why they do is because they're utilizing soul and they're putting that into consciousness, and then they're kind of giving the consciousness this infinite realm of possibilities, where if we really look at it through a naturalistic lens, then you can see that the consciousness in and of itself just exists within the being that exists. But once the being ceases to exist, consciousness ceases to exist as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that at this very moment, yes, there are two separate entities and two separate confrontations to be had against the supernatural essence of soul and consciousness. And then you have the other prospect, which is also there, which shows us the more naturalistic extent of consciousness in and of itself. And now we got to combat between the two, of which one holds precedence and everything like that. However, what I would also state, which is the next question, which is what constitutes evidence. I think certain amount of evidence actually comes through definitely science, but at the same exact time through philosophical inquiry. Because if something seems inconsistent, then that inconsistency can lead to that thing not actually existing within the realm in and of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My answer to that question, I mean, I've had to deal with this question about 50 times in the last month already, you know, on Facebook and stuff. And my answer to this question is always, well, that's up to the person who has to provide the evidence, what the evidence is. I can't say what the evidence is going to be until you present me with evidence. Then I've got to weigh up that evidence as to how how important that evidence is compared to other evidence. I have to weigh up, whether it changes the scenario at all in any way.
Right.
So I can't actually say what the evidence is going to be. You've got to just provide evidence that you think is going to work, and then that will get added into the equation. And if the equation still comes out as it's a load of horse shit, then that's what it'll still be. That if it changes it and starts giving it some validity, then it's going to change it, give it some validity, and then we can discuss where to go from there.
Absolutely. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I think that there's different forms of evidence, and I would just kind of simplify it. Like the weakest form of evidence would be anecdotal, so just hearsay, just what people tell you. If a lot of people tell you the same thing, yeah, that's evidence, but is it considered strong evidence? Maybe, but usually anecdotal evidence is considered usually in a court of law as the weakest form. But then there's really strong evidence, which would be novel testable predictions. So I could say, look, if evolution is true, then we should find this particular fossil that resembles this in this particular strata, in this particular layer. That's a new or novel prediction. And if we actually go and we dig into that strata and find exactly what we were looking for, that would be evidence that my model was true, because I made a prediction and it was valid, and that counts as evidence, actually very good evidence. And so again, the question is, can someone provide some sort of novel testable prediction regarding the soul? Actually, there has been evidence for different things like consciousness, these sort of ideas of consciousness lingering on after death. I've heard all of these things and seen all of these things. There were certain predictions made that were verified, but they didn't verify what a lot of people thought they were going to verify. And so the evidence pointed in one direction, and it didn't necessarily verify what maybe a lot of people were hoping it would verify. But that's evidence. That's how it works. You make a prediction, and you say that if this is true, this should happen. Let's run the experiment. If it happens and you can repeat it and verify it, you've got good evidence, and you can start building a theory.
Yeah. I just want to answer inquires abound there, because I think this point is towards me and what I just said there. He's saying that, in other words, it's a personal evaluation of the evidence presented. For my answer, I was talking in a thing. If you're trying to convince me, or if a theist, for instance, I don't know if you're theist or not. If a theist is trying to convince me to believe in a soul, for instance, then it is going to be my personal evaluation of any evidence that is presented as to whether I start believing in that said soul or not. So that would be a personal evaluation. If you're talking about having an actual scientific paper written on it, then it's going to have to be obviously evaluated by a group of a scientific committee who are doing tests and verification, collecting all of the data on it. And then I would obviously put that into my own personal evaluation as well.
Yep. That's how it works. That is how it works. And I understand what he's saying, because evidence for one person might not be good evidence for another. So it's kind of subjective in a way. But then that's why we have the tools of science to kind of get out of our subjectivity and come to an agreed upon set of evidences. So you can't deny the facts. So if you can establish the fact that if we run this experiment over and over and over, then this is how reality is going to behave. This is what we can expect is going to happen. If I pick up a ball and I drop it, something like that, and it falls every time, that's evidence that gravity exists, right? Now, I may not know exactly what gravity is, but I know that when I let go of something, it falls towards the earth, right? And so that's evidence that this thing actually exists, whereas what sort of experiments do we have that we can run about the soul? Can we do anything like that? Like, if it exists, what experiments can we have to confirm that? That's what I want to know.
That's very interesting. And also, what I would say is that definitely science is something that should, but that's a different part though, right? Because if we're really looking at soul, we're not necessarily looking at the scientific evaluation of what a soul is. Because then after somebody, just like how Inquirers Abound stated, how could somebody who constitutes, let's just say, consciousness as a soul would completely agree with our statements, what we're making right now? But at the same time, they would say that at this very moment, the evidence for the evidence for consciousness in science at this moment, along with neurology, is not up at that level. It's not at that level yet, right?
Well, let me correct you. Only because I've been forced into looking into stuff, because I have weird conversations with a lot of strange people all the time. So over the years, I've been forced to kind of look into stuff. Yeah, and there's a lot of obscure things that a lot of people just aren't aware of that happen to be true. They actually do have a study for the soul. My legitimate scientists, neuroscientists, physicists, and so on. And this is called the AWARE study. I think it's in Tucson, Arizona. Then they've got one called the PAIR study out in the UK. Same thing, and it's headed by
Yeah, I've heard of
neurosurgeon.
that.
Yeah, neurosurgeon Sam Parnia. He's an atheist, by the way. And his take is that, well, consciousness does exist after death, at least for a little while, but he can't speak on it after that because there's no way to measure it. But he has verified it because, like I said, he did a prediction. If this is true, this is what we should expect. They ran the experiment, and they have like thousands of data to support it. That people were able to identify certain things after their brain went flatline. They were able to identify, understand what people are talking about in another room. See things, describe colors, blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff was verified. There's like thousands of these cases between the AWARE study and the PAIR study. And the conclusion is that consciousness is just weird. It's kind of like a hard drive. You know how when your computer, you turn it off, the little light doesn't just automatically go black, but it slowly dims away, So Parnia's idea is that I think what happens is consciousness may live for a few minutes, maybe even an hour or so after the brain flatlines. After that, it probably just dissipates, as far as I can tell.
Though, another professor, I was reading a thing on that PAIR study, and there was another professor within that university who was on the study as well, who gave another explanation as to why this evidence may have these discoveries may have been this way, is that our instruments are not sensitive enough to actually categorize the exact moment of actual death. So it could be that hour or so afterwards, they're still actually technically alive, but our instruments record them as dead.
Gotcha.
That is actually pretty good. That's actually a pretty good way of looking at it. I can only go on for 7 minutes, and after we're going to make supper and stuff like that. So, but I do agree that so the show needs to come to an end. But I do agree, though, that when we look at something, a person in death, for instance, there's a lot of times where people were proclaimed dead because their breath is so shallow that, as Katy stated, we just don't know what's going on and everything like that. And so our instruments don't know that the person is still technically alive and everything like that, or in a vegetative state, right? And then so consciousness could continue until the actual death of this particular individual, if that is the case. But what I was meaning is that sometimes along with science, we need also philosophy to come in as well, right? And I think that philosophy in and of itself is based on inquiry, which is also beneficial when asking these type of questions if it's lent to philosophy in a sense. And if they're asking it based on a philosophical narrative, then there is ways to utilize philosophy in order to disprove a soul, for instance, and everything towards that extent. So I just think that at this very moment, the idea of soul is still kind of up in the air. Oh, hold on. There's another question that's right there. So, sorry. That's what I was trying to answer. My apologies. Is that I think that the question should be questioned and answered by science, but at the same exact time, philosophy. And if it can withstand those two and still be able to be argued, to be existed, and let alone have the evidence behind it, then I think it's fine. But if philosophically it's wrong and also scientifically it's wrong, there's a high probability that it doesn't exist. So I think that we need to use both instruments in order to ask that question.
Basically, philosophy categorizes it and science proves it.
Yeah, that's right.
So they both work in unison. They always have done.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's right.
But if philosophy categorizes it and then science can't prove it, it may still be true, but it may just take science a little bit longer to develop the instruments needed and the techniques needed to be able to demonstrate it. But that doesn't mean that we should just suddenly start believing it, because then it's a gap argument. And it's like, well, science can't say one way or the other right now, so we should just believe it. That's right. Philosophically illogical as well. So
right, that's right.
Absolutely.
Now, Inquirers Abound is asking a question you already know I'm dying to answer that one.
You're up on this one.
Jump in.
Who are scientific realists and anti-realists? All right. So somebody won a Nobel Prize this last year in October. Now, this is going to throw a wrench in everything we're talking about. Interesting stuff. So, if someone wins a Nobel Prize in physics, it's because they've ran enough experiments and did enough validation for a particular claim, theory, what have you. Well, there's this sort of scientific question that came from metaphysics, actually. Metaphysics asked, is reality real? How can we know? And so this was kind of explored 100 years ago. And Einstein was on the realist side. He said, no, what's real is time and space. That's fundamental. Time, space, energy, matter, mass, all of that is what makes up reality. And we can test it, we can observe it, case closed. And then you had, I guess, Heisenberg, on the other hand, said, nah, there's this thing called an uncertainty principle and quantum entanglement and things like that are real. And Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. And scientists were kind of on the fence either way, because, quantum mechanics is a thing, but then, it's one of these things that has to be interpreted. And then interpretations are all subjective, and there's no consensus on the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. So as it was, science remained silent on the question. But then came along a dude named John Bell, who in the 80s ran an experiment and supposedly ran some loophole tests, what he calls Bell test. And he closed certain loopholes to kind of say, well, is reality real that we see, that we measure? Is that the real thing? Is that the fundamental thing? Or is all this stuff that we do just not fundamentally real? Like it's some sort of weird thing going on. So the question is quantum mechanics real, or is relativity real? And so they finally ran the experiments last year and proven without a doubt that actually local realism is false. That's a false philosophy. That in actuality, matter, time, space, mass, all of this stuff that we measure is not real at all. It's a product of our imagination. And that what's very real is the fundamentals of randomness. Now, all of this sounds weird because it's like, well, if none of this stuff is fundamentally real, how do we really know that it's not really real? Like, it's sort of self-refuting. But you'd have to read through the experiment. That's the great thing about science, is it sort of transcends our subjectivity and interpretations, and we can kind of look at it more objectively. But these guys, anyways, they won a Nobel Prize on this back in October. So anyone can read about it. I posted a little thing there in the private chat.
Reading about that.
Yeah, I think the name of who were the guys that won?
But it sort of makes sense, though, when you think about quantum mechanics. I mean, I've studied a bit of quantum mechanics myself, and none of that actually makes any sense. I mean, I had a tutor who was teaching me some quantum mechanics, and the first thing that he ever said to me was, the first thing you need to do when learning quantum mechanics is throw common sense out the window. You won't be needing that for this course. And, I think that's a bit of that with, what these guys have discovered as well. It turns everything on its head about all the science that we've got all right up until this date with relativity and everything. It throws that on its head. But it also throws all of the religion and everything on its head as well. So,
hey, he's right. That's the thing. It makes us more skeptical, if anything, rather than think that there's something we know. It just means that reality is just weirder than we thought. It's even weirder than what the religions try to tell us. And I'm fine with that. That's cool.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's something that people slowly started to learn about when we looked at not just consciousness or scientific outlook on consciousness, but at the same exact time how we perceive things, because there are certain things that we just can't perceive because we just don't have the know-how how to do it, because evolutionarily we didn't need those.
Yeah.
And henceforth, because of that, we don't need those in order to survive. And kind of like how you stated within your conversation with Greg, that you stated that evolution does not need to be within the realm of reality, or what is really like the fundamental objective reality which we have. It's based on our most approximate guess of what that environment is in order to help us have the best chance at survivability.
This neuroscience scientist called Donald Hoffman, we had spoke about that before, Joshua. He uses a really good analogy with this, and it's based on evolutionary game theory. And he says basically you can look at consciousness as an interface on your desktop. So when you look on your desktop, you're seeing the recycle bin, you're seeing the folder, you're seeing your email link, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to compose an email, you just double click your email link and you can compose your email. But if you had to actually understand the zeros, the ones, the data structures, and then beyond that, the transistors, the electricity, the fields, everything that creates the computer, you would never send a fucking email because you're too busy trying to understand all these things. So that's the whole purpose of the interface, is to give you a shortcut into getting things done. And so your brain sort of does the same thing. It's giving you a shortcut. So when you perceive your reality, it's kind of like you're perceiving icons on a desktop. You're not really seeing the real thing for what it is, because if you did, you wouldn't survive very long out in the wild. And he proved that through evolutionary game theory. So when you put that together, like you said, you put that together with this local realism being debunked type of thing, then you get a really weird reality that we might be part of.
I've always used the argument when it comes to this realist, anti-realist thing. I've always used the argument of, well, whether it's real, our reality, or whether it's not real, our reality, we experience our reality. Right. So we have to go with what we experience.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no point in trying to make predictions and everything on things that we're not experiencing.
No access to it, right.
Because it's of no use to us.
That's metaphysics. We don't have access to metaphysics by definition. Right.
But the one thing that I would kind of push back on, in a sense, is that we do create mechanisms that can reach into the realms that we ourselves cannot access personally.
Oh, yeah. Like mathematics.
Exactly. So if this is the case, then there is certain ways in order to gain information, in order to actually at least tickle that intuition and bring the world, which we don't understand, closer to us than we can possibly imagine.
What you're referring to is one of the biggest theories in theoretical physics right now, the amplituhedron theory, which is the mathematics that points to mathematical structures beyond space-time. So they're going beyond the 10 to the minus 23 Planck scales in order to sort of understand what came before, what's the bigger cosmos made of or whatever. They've actually got mathematical equations to actually kind of explore that questions, which is really cool. So it's kind of like a example of what you're talking about, like the way we can sort of transcend,
Exactly. But now
as towards this next question, Josh. I think this is going to go in quite deep on this next question.
It's firing philosophy.
You said that you only had 7 minutes left, and that's
so sadly we can't necessarily answer this question tonight because we do definitely the family need to eat. So
we could make a show on this next question
tonight.
Yeah.
However, I would love to actually answer that question on the other show that we're going to have tomorrow when I'm actually going to be speaking with Cease to Know. And this question right here would be a really good question to bring up with Cease to Know. So if you really want to come in, and he's also a philosopher as well. So if you want to jump in and see that conversation, come and check in tomorrow, and it's going to be a fantastic conversation. And if the more the merrier, and more questions, the better. So anyways, everybody, last second statement, Scott and Katy, what are you?
My thought is it was a great conversation. I'm agnostic still, but discussing it just kind of rehashes the reasons why I'm agnostic, at least from everything I've heard and everything we've talked about. But it's a fascinating question. Maybe an eternal soul would be cool, maybe not. I have no idea.
Right. And again, just like how Linear stated, if you have any unanswered questions, please hit them up in the comment section below so that we can actually answer them on next show before really delving into the topic matter at hand on next show. So that would be
that question though. What is baloney?
Wow, the insults are being thrown.
Right, exactly.
Do a show on that. What is baloney?
What is baloney? Bologna. What is bologna?
But I think it's another word for something that comes out of a cow's ass.
All right, everybody. It was fantastic having this conversation. Thank you, Katy, and thank you, Scott, for coming on in and having this fantastic discussion. It's opened up my eyes and opened up different concepts to me as well. So thank you both so much. Thank you, everybody in the comments section, for engaging, and definitely inquires abound. Thank you for asking those questions, because those questions were great questions to be asking, and I think more people need to be asking those type of questions on shows like this. So thank you very much. And also thank you I forgot the name. Thank you Colder Pizza also for also engaging, and everybody else in the chat for engaging. Have a great night, and I will see you tomorrow on the Atheist Enlightenment. For now, have a great night and chicken peace.
Nice.